Hello, everyone, and welcome to this celebration of the launch of the book Unnatural Disasters, Tales of Enchantment, Danger, and Survival from Orion Magazine. This book collects writing from top authors, including Jeffy Ball, Samantha Hunt, Lauren Groff, and not least, our two special guests today, Victor LaValle and Carmen Maria Machado. It's available now from Orion's website. In a moment, I'll put a direct link for you to buy the book in the Zoom chat. In the chat, we'll also share two discount codes so you can save 20% on the book and if you want, on an annual subscription to Orion Magazine. And we'll also email you those codes after the event. So check for them in chat, but you'll also get them in your inbox. Unnatural Disasters explores nature's dark side, strange phenomena, unforgiving and unwelcoming environments, peril and risk, decay and collapse. In this way, it cuts against the grain of some strains of traditional nature writing, which tend toward sentimental worship of non-human organisms and wild, remote landscapes. This move of bringing danger and fear back into our engagements with the more than human world brings to mind for me the Romantic era, when awe and the sublime, this sense of being dwarfed and overwhelmed by the enormity and unknowability of nature, were key characteristics of all kinds of genres, travel writing, poetry, and novels, things like Frankenstein and Wuthering Heights. Unnatural Disasters also connects with today's environmental politics. So some scholars and advocates describe our current climate emergency as global weirding. You know, the predictable biophysical cycles of the Earth are broken. We find ourselves plunged into uncertainty and precarity. Earlier this year, our Center for Science and the Imagination at Arizona State University published the Climate Action Almanac. And we asked our writers to imagine hopeful futures shaped by climate action at the local level. But nevertheless, like these threads of horror and weird fiction kept creeping into the pieces. It was like we couldn't, keep it out. We couldn't bar the door. So in that sense, Unnatural Disasters captures something ambient in our encounters with the natural world today. This unease, a sense of being out of balance, vitiated, topsy-turvy. And the writing in the anthology, I think, helps us process those emotions and figure out the best way to find our footing in a world that human activity has rendered newly menacing. So I'm honored to be here today with all of you to celebrate this book and with Orion Magazine. And our team at the Center for Science and the Imagination and our team at Orion are really excited about not just this conversation, but also seeing the effects this book has as it reaches more people and the conversations that it's able to start kind of stemming from and building on this one. So I'm going to get out of the way soon, but I'll begin by introducing our speakers and moderator for today. So our first special guest is Victor LaValle. Hi, Victor. Victor
Hello.
is the author. Hello. Victor's the author of a bunch of things: the short story collection Slapboxing with Jesus, 5 novels, including The Ecstatic and Big Machine, and 2 novellas, Lucretia and the Kroons and the Ballad of Black Tom. He's also the creator and writer of 2 comic books, Eve and Victor LaValle's Destroyer. And last year, his novel, The Changeling, was adapted into a series for Apple TV+. He's been the winner of the World Fantasy Award, Bram Stoker Award, and Shirley Jackson Award. Thanks so much for being here, Victor. Our second guest is Carmen Maria Machado. Carmen is the author of the best-selling memoir In the Dream House, the graphic novel The Low, Low Woods, and the short story collection Her Body and Other Parties. She has been a finalist for the National Book Award and the winner of the Bard Fiction Prize and Lambda Literary Awards for lesbian fiction and LGBTQ nonfiction. Her essays, stories, and criticism have appeared in The New Yorker, The New York Times, Granta, Vogue, The Believer. I could go on and on, Guernica. So Carmen, thank you also for being with us today.
Thank you.
And our formidable moderator for today's conversation is Christopher Cox. Christopher is the co-editor of Unnatural Disasters and editor-at-large at Orion. He's the former editor of Harper's Magazine and a former senior editor of the Paris Review. Work that he's edited has won everything: the National Magazine Award, the Penn Literary Award for Journalism, an Overseas Press Club Award, and has been included in several Best American collections. So with all that out of the way, all your plaudits and bona fides. Without further ado, Christopher, I'll hand it over to you to lead up our conversation.
Great. Thank you, Joey. Wow. That was a wonderful introduction. I feel like almost don't have to talk about the book anymore, so maybe I'll just show it to you. Wait, there's the blurred
There you
part.
go.
Oh no, it's blurred.
Oh, yeah, I can fix this. I can fix this. It cannot be blurred. Okay, you guys are gonna see my actual bedroom in the background. Just
There
ignore
you
that.
go.
Okay, there we go. It has these like beautiful end papers designed by Stanley Donwood. If you want to buy the book, I think Joey just put the link in the chat. And then for those of you tuning in, if you have questions, there is the opportunity to ask questions of our esteemed panelists, and you can do that in the Q&A tab, which on the bottom of your Zoom window, there should be a little Q&A button with little cartoon bubbles if you look for that. So put those in there, and we'll get to those toward the end. And I'll just echo a little bit of what Joey said about the book itself. Some of you might think it's a little bit strange for Orion Magazine, which exists in many ways to get readers to learn to love and appreciate the natural world, is publishing a book full of death and fear and some of the scarier parts of nature. And it's true, there are bear attacks in this book. There are multiple rabid animals. There are deadly rip currents, man-eating crocodiles. A lot of times when we were editing this book and sort of selecting it, I kept hearing Werner Herzog's voice in the back of my head, sort of talking about being the harmony of overwhelming collective murder. It was like his description of nature. But the other thing to know about this book is that we've chosen as the epigraph a quote from Jordan Peele, which is, "Humanity is the monster." And I think that holds true for a lot of the essays, and it's essays and short stories and poetry in this book. It holds true for a lot of the contributions that are in this book. Always hiding somewhere in the background, there is man and mankind's. Well, I'm thinking about what you said about the sublime, Joey. Like, the sublime is the awe we feel at something that is both beautiful and capable of destroying us. And what is more capable of destroying us than us? So if you read the book, you'll see these things coming together. Death, destruction, wildlife, fear of the power of nature, but also man's role in all of that. And in fact, this is a story. One of the stories about rabies is about a rabid bat, but it actually is a story about health insurance. This is a story about why is it that if you get bitten by a bat, the state will pay for your vaccines with no need for you to pay out of pocket, but we can't do that for other equally important health matters in this country. So those are kind of the dueling spirits behind this book. And as Joey said, both Victor and Carmen are contributed to this book. Victor wrote the foreword. Carmen has an essay in it that originally appeared in Orion. And I wondered if we could just start with both of you by telling us about what you wrote for the book. Victor, can we start with you?
Sure. Happy to be here talking with you, and honored to be doing this with Carmen. So for me, I wrote about an incident that we had, my family and my wife and two kids, during the pandemic. We essentially were holed up in this in our little two-bedroom apartment, like many people, for the length of that time, whatever it was, 2 years or 20 years, whatever the amount of time it was. And then toward the end of it all, we had two friends who had like a country house who basically said, like, you all have been stuck there long enough. And also things had started to sort of relax a bit. There was actually a vaccine, things like that. And so they said, why don't you come up for a visit? And so we went up there to have this like joyful country time. And then this rabid squirrel showed up and like trapped us in their house. And it was it was like ridiculous, you know. I mean, like, what could be a more like city folk thing than like we all ran away from a squirrel? I mean, not a squirrel, I'm sorry, a raccoon, a raccoon. Squirrel sounds preposterous. Raccoon just sounds ridiculous. But it was something that seemed truly like, as maybe particularly because we had been living, as most of us had, in such sort of like fear of the world sort of coming for us kind of thing. And then we get up there with our kids, and then literally this raccoon comes ambling out of the woods, fearless and sort of half blind, and just comes right for us. And it was a, in retrospect, a funny experience, but genuinely in the moment, we were all like, we're gonna survive COVID and get killed by a raccoon, is what we thought was gonna happen. So that's what I wrote about in the forward, and trying to like frame it within the realities of the pandemic, but also that sense of the sort of one of the themes of the anthology as a whole, which felt like, nature is not always, nature doesn't want to give you a big hug. Nature sometimes wants to come smashing right into you. And that was the sort of energy I wanted to get across, in that sense of people being sort of faced with that, and having to reckon with it.
Great, thanks. And Carmen, your story is called The Blob. Will you tell us what that's about?
Yeah, well, and also happy to be here. So happy to be here with Victor, happy to be here with you. So before I talk about The Blob, I do want to say that if I had written something for the anthology, so this was obviously a story I'd written for Orion that then got gathered into the anthology. If you had been like, write a horror story about nature, I would have also written about rabies, because rabies is, I actually once had to get rabies shots because my dog and I were attacked by a rabid raccoon, and in my early 20s, and it was super terrifying, and I am very scared of rabies, and it's a very long, very stressful story. But yeah, and I find that sort of thing just very chilling. And I find I'm one of those people, I'm absolutely in awe of nature, and like definitely terrified of it. Even though I enjoy it and I love it, but it is something that I'm just like a very small, very like sort of, repentant creature in the face of like Mother Nature. I'm just like, don't kill me, please. But The Blob is about, so I'm working on a book right now, a new book that involves sort of celestial phenomena as like one of the themes of the book. And so I've been doing some research about just various, sort of intersections of space and humanity that happen sort of on Earth or in proximity to Earth. And one of the sort of phenomena that I read about was this thing called star jelly, which is sort of this like mystery we don't fully understand. Like, it might be a kind of like fungus that like is on Earth and actually has nothing to do with space. But when it does appear, people often think that it like came from space. And there have been these like sort of moments of time where this star jelly has appeared on the ground, and people have been like, oh, like it was delivered here from outer space. And so I think when I had written the piece for Orion, I think the prompt had been like mysteries of nature. And I was like, oh, I literally just was reading about this thing called star jelly. And so I wrote a story about a pair of siblings who discover star jelly, and the brother, it's like a brother and a sister, and the brother kind of wrecks it, and the sister is like protected and like very, like feels very sad when it's gone. And then they later go see the movie The Blob, like the horror movie The Blob, which I lived in Philadelphia. And it's really close to where like The Blob was filmed, and there's like a Blob Fest every year in Phoenixville. And I feel like but anyway, The Blob was apparently, star jelly was like an inspiration for The Blob. And so I was like, so like at the end of the story, they go and see The Blob in theaters, and she's remembering this like thing that like her brother had destroyed. So it's just sort of about like the fear of nature, like there's two responses to it. Like she has awe, he has this destructive impulse, and then sort of the grief about that sort of dynamic. It's a very short story. It was like a piece of flash, but I really love it. So
Yeah, no, it's a really fun story. And I guess maybe that leads me to my next question, which is, absent Orion coming to you with a prompt, like how often do you both find yourself sort of thinking about the natural world or natural phenomenon as a sort of way to get started on a piece of fiction or a piece of writing? Is that like a well that you return to?
Victor, oh, do you? Oh.
Please,
I
after
mean,
So I write about it a lot, and I realized recently I was looking back through my memoir, which I haven't looked at in a while, and there's so much material about the natural world in there because I write a lot in residencies, which are often in like natural settings, where I'm like in the woods, or like one of the residencies I was in Eastern Oregon, and like on the lip of like the playa, like this like dried up sort of lake, this like really mysterious, very like alien looking sort of natural landscape. And I'm always having animal encounters at residencies. So I write about like there was a hawk that got tangled in my laundry. There was a time I came out of my cabin and there was like an owl that I swear to God was the size of my torso, just like sitting on a rock, like very, very close to it. There was a time that I came back to my cabin and there was like half a rabbit just like ripped in half and just like on like in front of the door, like the mob like left me a message. And I wrote about that. And I think that was like my memoir. And I think it was also in, I fictionalized it in my first book, in my story, The Resident, which takes place at a residency. And there's many more besides. So I feel like I was always constantly having weird animal encounters, just sort of encounters in the natural world. And like, I am not a hiker. I'm kind of an indoor cat. So like, I'm not a big hiker. I'm not a big like camper. So I'm not like in nature kind of immersed in it, except when I am at residencies, but I do so many of them. And like, I do find like being in the natural world so stimulating and so beautiful. And I like taking walks and I like kind of being in it, that I do feel like, yeah, I'm constantly having like weird animal encounters. So definitely I feel like the natural world intrudes into my work, my fiction and my nonfiction, quite a lot, just because it's like a part of not just my life, but like my writing life specifically. And yeah, and so it shows up a lot. And I think, and again, like I find it so kind of weird and mysterious. It makes sense that it would, and I'm like interested in like weird and mysterious things, and how they make me feel. And so I feel like it just pops up in a lot of my work in various contexts.
Thanks.
For me, like I'm a city kid born and raised, New York City kid born and raised, and we've got our kids, so I'm mostly in New York. So the way that nature comes from me, I'm very interested in what aspects of what we call nature survive here, right? And find a way to sort of assert themselves here. And maybe I've become even more aware because my wife is also a writer. Her name's Emily Roboteau, and she's been writing about climate. She's written in Orion as well. She's been writing about climate more and more over the last 8 years or so. And so I get to kind of peek over her shoulder about aspects, and she's particularly writing often about where we live in the Bronx, and the ways that nature is sort of asserting itself, making itself known there. And so one of the more interesting ones lately is just the fact that where we live in the Bronx is a neighborhood called Kingsbridge, and it's built on a swamp, right? Like much of the Bronx is. And so there's a constant push and pull. So there was a swamp, and then they put garbage over that, and then they put dirt over that, and then they built houses over that, right? And so there's a constant push and pull in Kingsbridge and the surrounding areas, where the swamp is always trying to take it back, kind of thing, like take the land back. So flooding is a constant issue, and rather than seeing it like thanks to Emily, like rather than seeing it simply as like, oh, this is just a hassle as a homeowner, seeing it instead as almost like the land is trying to revert to its true form, and you people keep refusing to let it revert or evolve back into its true form. And I find that a really interesting sort of way to be thinking about. In fact, even where we are in the Bronx, there's a creek that had been paved over for a century. That is, they're about to reopen it, essentially, like unearth it. It's a practice called daylighting, and they're going to daylight this canal in part to help kind of divert some of that flooding water that that is an issue. And the hope is that it would turn into a sort of walking path, kind of like the High Line in downtown New York. But the only difference is this path would be right alongside the Cross Bronx Expressway. So it's a hellish expressway that is always crowded. There's tons of smog. So it's that thing of like nature gets a little something back, and then the humans sort of mess up everything around it. I feel like that's the theme of where we are. But those are some of the ways that I'm thinking about nature within the city, and thinking about the idea that obviously it's almost a cliche to say, obviously, but nature is everywhere.
Right. Yeah, I heard about that project. That's Tibbetts Brook, that whole
Tibbetts Brook. That's right. That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, she's tracking it very closely. I'm very interested in like what will actually come of it.
Right. In the description of this event, you're both described as writers or speculative writing. That's your field. Do you embrace that as a sort of catch-all term? Is there a catch-all term for what you do?
I mean, I think speculative is appropriate to describe my work. I mean, I work in a lot of different genres. I feel like the genre that to me most like kind of overarches my work, I would say, is horror. Like that's actually, I would probably more describe myself as a horror writer than a speculative writer, but I also think speculative is appropriate. I just think that like, because I think of horror as like, you know, an overwhelming mood of dread, as sort of atmospheric, and that is sort of the space that I'm interested in operating in, even when I'm writing like more or less like realist work, which I do sometimes. Like I feel like it's still operating in this sort of horror mode. And so, yeah, like I would say that's the word that I would choose for myself personally. But yeah, speculative feels appropriate. I mean, you know, I think that people are constantly trying to give words to genres, and it's interesting, I think, you know, almost like in a pedagogical way, but I don't find it very interesting as a writer. Like I'm like, I don't know, I write what I write. I sort of know what I like, and I know kind of what I'm going for. And so to me, the sort of language is not as important. But also, yeah, I would say for me, I would say horror feels the closest to what I would describe my work being.
Yeah, maybe that's really my question. Like, what term do you feel most drawn toward? And so that's interesting to hear you say it's horror. So yeah, Victor, do you have an answer to that?
I would agree wholeheartedly with Carmen. I was going to say that like I embrace horror as forget even like as a genre, but as a sort of theme, right? And that sense that, again, as Carmen said, that realism, sci-fi, historical fiction, literary realism, whatever you want to call it, they all can contain horror. You know, and one of the things even in the anthology that was kind of fun for me was like, as I was reading through the pieces, I was like, oh, I can't wait to read all these ghost stories and monsters. And I was like, oh no, this is the different kind of horror. This is like the real horror, like real things that could be or are on the edge of what you question, but feeling very happy that this too would be grouped in with that, you know, because with the idea of something horrific, horrifying, horror, and also maybe on a sort of cultural / political-ish level, I embrace the term horror only because it is such a degraded term, right? It is, I feel like it's kind of like the thing you're not supposed to say you write if you are serious, right? And I really like the idea of saying like, I'm very serious and I write horror, and not making any distinctions about elevated horror or this kind of horror, anything like that. So speculative, I think, is great. Sometimes there's other terms, whatever they might be, but at heart, I think underneath it all, horror is always there.
Yeah, like I would describe my memoir as horror, even though it's a memoir. Like I think that truly it is. Yeah, and it's such a genre or whatever you want to call it, because it does encompass all, because like genre is about like readerly expectations, right? So when I say to you, like, if I say to you, this is a realist story, and then a dragon shows up, you'd be like, wait, that's confusing, because like that's not what's in a realist story. That's your expectation as a reader is like sort of tweaked by the label of the genre. But horror is nice because horror can be like, you can have ghosts monsters, serial killers, environmental horror. Like horror can actually encompass like all of these different sort of modes of reality and sort of modes of expectations from a reader. But the sort of the shared element is this like dread and this sort of like building sort of atmospheric fear that is like coming from some source or another. And that to me is like that's the most interesting thing.
Related to that, this sense of dread, I mean, definitely it's present in the stories in the book and it's present in your work. But I think of both of you as very funny writers. And I mean, you are, don't just think of you that way. You are both very funny writers. And how do you get those two to sit together? I mean, it seems like if I thought of it as a formal puzzle, it would seem like it's insolvable, and yet you solve it, again and again. So do you think about that deliberately, or is that just how it arrives on the page?
For me, I would say I tend to think actually that like horror and humor are kissing cousins, kind of thing. That both, in a way, like both are outsized reactions to strange events, surprising moments, things that defy expectation, right? Like so many horror movies, I would say actually, like, and horror novels and all the rest. The danger of horror is that it tips into self-seriousness and becomes silly, right? And I would say that happens most for the things that take themselves too seriously, and that in fact the beauty and the value of humor, sort of aligned with horror, is that there are times just when something is so preposterous, so frightening, so terrifying, you do have to laugh. I mean, it is a natural human reaction to near-death experiences, or near harm experiences at the very least, is to burst into laughter rather than to scream in terror, right? Like you can go kind of either way, and so I think that there's something to that idea that, like, even also tonally for a story, it's impossible. Like you can't make somebody laugh all the way through a story, and you can't make somebody feel fear all the way through a story. But if you balance between the two, I think people feel like they've gone like on some huge highs and some great lows. And in that way, they feel like they've had a chance to have the depth and breadth of emotional experience. So for me, they feel like I almost don't understand how you have one without the other.
Yeah. I mean, I would second all of that, obviously. And I think that and I agree that I feel like when horror fails, at least for me as a reader, it is because it's serious, or there's no levity and there's no breathing space for the reader at all. So it just becomes relentless, but like not in a good way. Like it just becomes, it's like this oppressive sort of thing. And I do read horror like that, and I don't care for it because I'm like, I don't know, I feel there's like no space for me in here. And I think that like it's like horror and humor like elevate each other, right? So it's like you have sort of moments of like abject horror, and then you have moments of like levity, and then like the sort of the movement between them creates this like kind of interesting energy that I think heightens the effect of both. And yeah, they just really work in sync with each other. I agree that they almost seem like two slightly different reactions to like the overwhelming sort of like, or like the blankness of the words. Like you laugh because you don't know what to do, right? And then if you don't know what to do, that's also terrifying, right? Because you're kind of frozen and don't really know how to respond. So like, yeah, I would say they're really related to each other. And I love I've been told that I'm a very funny writer. I do think about it. I think I'm actually a very funny person. It took me a long time to get over this like weird thing in my life where when I was growing up in my family, the sort of story about me was that I was like a humorless feminist bitch. And I had this like idea in my head for a very long time that I was like not a funny person and not a funny anything. And then I feel like when I started writing, I got to really explore humor and absurdity and like really getting to, like what does it mean to be like alive in this body in this moment, and like, trying to like make art for other people and like for myself, and how do we understand the like overwhelming quality of like the world around us. And so I feel like for me, it really actually was very empowering to like, and I remember like someone saying to me, like, you're a really funny writer, like you do have that. And it was actually a really like kind of lovely moment for me because I had never really thought of myself that way. And I also think that like, I don't know, I write about really serious stuff and then people meet me and they're like, you're so bubbly, like you're so like not how I expected you to be. And I think there's something kind of interesting there too about just like, yeah, because I am interested in the horror, but also I have to stay alive, right? Like if I was so overwhelmed by like, you know, if I thought too much and relentlessly and without any breaks about like the nightmares, how would I be able to like get up in the morning or like make breakfast or leave the house, right? And so I think that like there's also something about humor allows for survival in a horrifying world. And so I think again, this is all to say, again, these things are just like two sides of the same coin, or they're like cousins, or they're like related to each other. Absolutely. Like you can't really successfully have one without the other.
Yeah, that makes sense. I guess I'm wondering just more generally, like, how do you achieve the effects that you achieve? So I think I read an interview with you, Carmen, where you said that you weren't a Hemingway fan, and I feel like that's a voice,
Yeah,
that's a deadpan voice, and those sentences seem ill-suited for horror in particular. But how do you think stylistically about, you know, how to get the effect that you want through your sentences, through your use of language? Like, is there an approach that sort of leads you down that road more easily?
I mean, it's funny you would say that. I mean, the source of my Hemingway ire really is truly, I just had to read too much Hemingway in high school. And I was like, please give me a woman, a person of color, like literally give me any other person besides this man over and over. And I was like, I got to the point where my teacher would not call on me anymore because I would just be like, and she would just be like, I'm not even calling on you. I don't want to hear you to say about Hemingway. I warmed to him a little bit in some contexts over the years, but I will say that like, I think I find him, that sort of, I think thinking about this sort of stripped back language, which can have its function. I think you could write a horror story in style. You absolutely could. Like, to be clear, like you absolutely could do that. And I think that it would have its own, that style of writing would have its own effect that could be used for various ways in the hands of the right writer. I really like, what's the word I'm looking for? I like dark, moist corners. I like sentences that have orifices. I like things that are a little meatier, a little bloodier, a little rotten, a little Baroque, a little like that's just sort of how my brain works. And I think is the kind of writing I want to do, like on a sentence level. And the kind of work that's interesting to me as a reader. But you absolutely could write like a horror story to Hemingway. Like you absolutely can. Like that's not like you can't do that. It's not what I want to do. But it is, you know, there are all kinds of ways to write horror. And I mean, I actually was just recently rereading Yoko Ogawa's Revenge, which is a book that I really love. And that's a book that has like a very stripped back style. Like the sentences are very sort of clean, and like the stories have a lot of like, I would say like aeration in them, or like there's just a lot of like white space. Like they're just like really interesting, but they're terrifying. It's just, yeah. So like that, again, that can't be done. Absolutely. But personally for me, I like just sentences that are a little more, I don't know, Baroque or bloody or something.
Bloody sentences. I like that.
And I would say, you know, at this point now, I've started to think maybe I don't really read that much for what the story is, or like that's only part of the reason I read. Mostly at this point, I think I read because I like hanging out with that writer. Like I just like spending time with that writer. And usually, so what that means for me is it's the writers I adore are the writers who have a degree of a voice, personality on the page. Even with whatever story they're telling, I always know there's going to be this kind of like skewed sense of humor, or they're going to be the kind of person who picks up, even like who writes in a certain style that sounds like a voice, that sounds like a perspective, and that maybe is in a way the way I've been approaching writing, in particular in more, I don't know, the more recent, like last 3-4 books, more thoughtfully. I've been realizing like the way I want the book to feel is just like Victor just sat you down and told you a story. And if you like having Victor talk with you, I'm going to stop third person. If you like having me talk with you, then this is going to go great. And if you don't really feel that interested in having a long chat with me, this is not a book for you. You know, like that the story itself is like, I've come to realize like there's writers who are telling a compelling story and yet somehow I bounce off the book. I don't feel that interested in the book. And then there are other writers who are kind of telling stories I've heard about the kind of people I think I've heard about before, and yet I keep coming back to those writers. And so when I'm trying to find my style, it has become more and more and more about like, would you like to just take a chair across from me, at the couch next to me, whatever it is. I thought up this wild thing, let me tell you about it. I thought up this fun thing, let me tell you about it. And like that now is almost like my entire sort of way into style. And like as I'm at different stages of life, as I'm at different ages, that voice, I think, changes. You know, like I'm currently in crabby, older, middle-aged dad phase. And so the thing I'm working on now is very snappish. Like it's just always, the voice in it is basically just like, I told you to hurry up and come on. Like that's the sound of the voice for this thing I'm working on now. Is that the most pleasing voice? I don't know. We're going to see if that sounds interesting, but it's kind of where I am. And I hope that that feels like interesting in the right way for the right people, you know.
And as you reach for that voice, is it one that just sort of naturally flows out of the typewriter, or does it still require the same amount of like, you know, revision, honing, you know, is it, if there's an earlier style that you had, does this one like come a bit more naturally, or is it still the same process, I guess, to get there?
If anything, I think the difference is that nowadays I'm not straining so hard to make you notice that I have a style, right? I'm not trying to do backflips in all the sentences and stuff in a way that I might have once when I was a newer writer. But it's not easier. I mean, it's still the same number of revisions, if not more, because now I appreciate that there's even more that can be done with a sentence, with a page, with a paragraph, with a whole book. So there's actually more work done, but I think maybe if anything, like I don't want you to see the work as much as a reader.
Carmen, have you sort of, could you sort of, I guess, chart for us in the same way that how you feel like maybe your voice has changed over, you know, from book one to where you are now?
Yeah, I mean, every book, there's such a weird thing about writing books where like once the book, even when the book is newly released, so like the public can read it, like that book is already in the past for you, for the author, right? So like there's something really strange about like doing, like I've written 3 books. One was a graphic novel, so I haven't really, and that was released during COVID. So, but like I had 2 prose books that I came out, I toured for them, and I was reading from them and I was editing the things I was reading in my brain. Like I literally like the reading copies I have are like marked up and I read them slightly differently because I've fixed my own senses. Now you can't go back and just like, I mean, I guess you could theoretically, but like mostly you don't, the book is done, right? And it's just sort of this moment in time. It's like who you were as an author at that very moment, or the moment, or not even the moment it comes out, but the moment that you handed it in and finished your edits and did all that stuff. It's like, that's it. And so if you're doing things correctly as a writer, the work that is behind you is always going to be, you're going to be like, I'm better than that now. Like, or like, I'm different than that now. Like I've moved like past it because I'm just continuing on my journey, and I'm, you know, my mind is changing. The way I think about sentences is changing, or evolving, or just like my life, you know, like now I have kids and I have a different relationship with time, or like whatever it is that's happening in your life and your relationship with like what you're writing about, how you're writing, style. Cause like sentences are essentially like, it's like you're almost getting the grooves of your brain. It's like you're putting, it's like the way that information moves through your head is kind of what the sentence looks like. And so obviously that's going to change because our minds change, right? Like we get better, we keep writing, we read more, we experience more things, and like that just evolves. So that's been true for me as well. I mean, it's weird. Like And then the weird thing too is that when people are reading your work, like I did an event like last week where somebody was like, I just discovered your fiction. I loved your first book. And it's wild because it's like, that book is so old to me. Like I wrote that book. The book came out 7 years ago. I wrote it, I finished it like 9 years ago. I am so beyond, I can barely remember what happens in it. Like they were like, I loved this part in this story. And I was like, I'm sure I wrote that, but I don't remember because it's literally just so far in the past. And like, I think that, but for that person, it's new. Like for that person, they're like encountering that work for the first time. And that's like a really specific, exciting moment, but also like you're somewhere else as the author, like you're way beyond that. And so, but I don't think that's like, I don't think that's a bug. That's a feature. Like, it's just like how it works to like be an artist that has a career that like stretches over a period of time. It's like, it's going to change, but I think it gets better. Like, I think I'm a better writer now than I was 10 years ago. I mean, thank God, right?
Right.
I think that's good. Like we want that to be true. But yeah.
We've got a couple of questions in the Q&A, which I think I should address now because people are worried. They're saying
I saw that, yeah.
they're creeped out by your empty bookshelves, Carmen. Can you talk about?
Hey. Oh.
I just moved, you guys. I just moved and things are in boxes and I'm just in a state of transition. So I have more books than any person should own in their lifetime. I have so many books. I could live to be 1,000 and never finish reading all of them. So don't worry about me. I've got plenty. They're just in boxes. I'm fine. And now there's one.
There you go. Yeah. And I'm sure we put Unnatural Disasters up there once you start.
Yes, that'll be once I'm done with the event. It's sitting next to me. Once it's done, I'll pop it on there too. Perfect.
Well, maybe that's a good transition to, I guess, the influence question. I'm sure you get it a lot. I know Carmen, you already mentioned Yoko Ogawa. And I guess maybe bonus points if there are any writers who you consider influences or were important to you in the past who write about the natural world, who sort of touch some of these topics we've talked about.
Oh, my.
Well, an all-time favorite writer for me is Shirley Jackson, certainly, and I feel like certainly all her books will take place, or not all, but many, in something like the sort of more rural-ish towns that she lived in. But the one I'm thinking of is We Have Always Lived in the Castle, only because it's got the death's head mushrooms, right? Death's head mushrooms. And there's so much business about being out there picking them, and then I don't know if this ruins it for anybody who may not have read it, but doing something terrible with those mushrooms. But she's a writer who, I mean, I just adore her no matter what. But in particular, what I find I adore about her is that she does that thing we were talking about earlier. She is incredibly funny, and then also so frightening. And the two really do go together so well. And in particular, I always admire her particular kind of humor is such a cruel and biting humor. Like she does not think much of human beings, and I agree with her. And like so many times in her work, and I just always admired that she never sort of flinched from that sort of perspective, like just cutting people down, like putting people in their place, that kind of thing in the work, including her own main characters. It's not like she thought her main characters were better than anyone else. They were just differently foolish, and I just always admired the way she could just cut people down and then still make you want to keep reading about them, which is kind of amazing, So that's one.
Yeah, I mean, Shirley Jackson for sure. I adore her and love her. I will say, actually, I think my answer is actually an author who is in the book, Bennett Sims, who is one of my favorite contemporary horror writers. He has written a bunch of books that cover sort of various natural things, but his most recent one, which is called Other Minds and Other Stories, which just came out from $2 Radio like this year, I think. like is really interested in other minds. So like cognition of like non-human cognition, natural cognition. There's like a whole story that's kind of narrated by Snow, sort of. It's sort of hard to explain, but he is a really interesting writer and somebody who I think what's amazing about him is he like me, I feel like sees horror in everything. Like he sees sort of that darkness coming from all these different sources, but he's so curious about it, and he's so curious about kind of where that's coming from. And his sentences are so incredibly precise. Like the way that he writes is so highly, highly attuned to the moment of the story and to his mind, like moving through the story in this way that is like absolutely delicious. And like Other Minds and Other Stories has this incredible short story about a man who has to kill a chicken, and it's just him desperate, but like a suburban man, like a man who doesn't know how to kill a chicken, but he has to kill a chicken, and he's like desperately trying to murder this chicken in his backyard. And it is genuinely one of the funniest, speaking of like horror and comedy, like it is genuinely one of the funniest stories I've ever heard. I've heard him read from it. It's I literally shriek laugh when I hear it because it's like so funny. And so, because it is so dark, but it's also this like this person is like imagining like the mind of this chicken, like, and he kind of hates the chicken, like he thinks the chicken kind of has it out for him. Like it's this very interesting. So yeah, so I feel like he is a writer who, whenever his eye lands on the natural world, which it does very often, he's always sort of creating these like perfectly delicious scenarios and sort of these sentences, and like he's really just interested in just like. He's definitely interested in science and like cognition. Like his first novel, Questionable Shape, is essentially a story about consciousness, but it's a zombie novel. So it's about like what is a zombie, and it's sort of like if like David Foster Wallace wrote a zombie novel. It's just really gorgeous, and is thinking a lot about the mind and like what the mind is, and like what does it mean to be alive, and what does it mean to think things. And it's just such a beautiful. And that book also has a lot of like really gorgeous. There's like this line in it that I literally think about constantly, where he talks about being in a field, and he's hearing geese crying, and he closes his eyes, and it's like being in a field of badly oiled swings, just like swinging back and forth, and that's the sound of the geese. So I feel like he's just like so attuned to like what's going on, and whenever he touches on nature, it's perfect. It's like so good, and he's a huge influence of mine. So.
Yeah, his story in the collection is all about a gecko
Mm-hmm.
crawling across the window.
Van der Waals forces, right? Which is like a kind of a concept of right, and like yeah, the gecko just like clinging to the window, like it's so yeah. Anyway,
let me see if there's more. Please put in Q&A questions if you got them. There's one that our generous host Joey has sent for us, which I'll read for you guys now. So much of our classic or canonical horror is cosmic or allegorical, so it's meant to stand in for universal, globe-spanning or transcendent issues. But so much of what you've talked about today is local and specific to a singular place and its particularities. Does echo or environmental horror require us to be a little bit more attentive to specific concrete places or spaces?
I mean, I think that like it's so, in a way, this is just the question of like fiction, where it's like, like I feel like when you're teaching, like I teach a lot, and when I teach, one of the earliest things that you sort of teach like a group of fiction, a student studying fiction, is like the universal is achieved through specificity, right? So like you don't write stories that mean something by writing very broad stories that could be about anybody or anything. It's like it's about a certain person in a certain moment in a certain place, and that is how we achieve this sense of like, and obviously that's why like you can't have it with one story. It's like fiction as an idea, we're like generating this sense of like human connection through these like very specific stories. And so in a way, it's like obviously the environment and sort of like that's huge, and it affects literally everybody. Like there's no person that the environment does not touch on this earth or anywhere else. But also we are in our bodies, and like ultimately it comes down to like our ability to function in the space that we're in, each of us sort of individually, as well as us as like a whole, as a humanity as a whole. So it's sort of like the same thing where it's both global and big, and like there's these big things. And I think this is actually, my suspicion is this is part of the problem why we've had trouble conceptualizing as a people like climate change, because it feels so big, and it's like, well, I can't do anything but the climate, like me personally, so like what am, you know, and we've conceptualized it so badly because it just feels like big and beyond us and elsewhere and huge. And then the problem, of course, is that all the little, you know, whatever, we know the problem, right? And now we have like just catastrophic, endless weather events that like feel like they were getting worse and worse every year. Every year is hotter and hotter. Like we know this, right? And so, yeah, so there's like this struggle, I think, for us to comprehend the hugeness of it and the bigness of it, but the way that we're exploring it is actually about our individual bodies in space. So yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Certainly agree with that. And the only thing I would add is perhaps that even the idea about the older stuff, I think a fair number of the things that have lasted have also stemmed from a deeply individual sort of perspective, or like could only have come from a very particular person and found a way to be universal, to Carmen's point. Like, I guess I always think about Frankenstein, whether you consider that sci-fi or horror, but just thinking about could that book have been written by any, in no way does it take away from Mary Shelley's genius, but someone who hadn't lost their mother at birth and wasn't then spending her entire childhood into her young adulthood yearning for a chance to bring her mother back. And then, in fact, in the novel itself, you find out that Victor Frankenstein, as much as it's about like science gone run amok and stuff, before that, you do find out that his mother died when he was quite young, and that the original reason why he enters into the sort of arcane and scientific paths to figure out how to conquer death is it's not stated explicitly, but the implication is it's because of that profound loss that he had, you know. And then that question of like a parent being a loving parent or a non-loving parent is the animating energy of that entire novel from then on. So that has become certainly a universal novel, but I do think it begins with just the absolute grief and loneliness of a girl who lost her mother, you know, and that feels deeply local in its own way, as much as Lovecraft in his own way is writing about his absolute fear of the modern world, right? In many ways, like he cannot accept that times are changing and that a person like him, who once was at the top of the heap of humanity, at least according to him, you know, his family had money, he was white, male, New Englander, but even in his own lifetime, he saw all of that lost. And the concept that even someone like him could be reduced to a pauper who lives alone, riddled with anxiety and fear. His particular version of cosmic horror, I think, only exists if that particular person tries to sort of embody the level of betrayal and terror they feel about the 20th century and how it's moving on from people like him. So even those ones, I think, are deeply local or personal, right? Now but the climate one, I agree with Carmen, is like similarly, you can't grasp it at the level of the globe, you know, like again, that's why my wife, I think, writes so much just about our little part of the Bronx, is just to say, speaking of this little part is my way to try to speak about the world, you know, but in a way that I can walk it, I can see it.
Well, right on time, we've got a question in the Q&A about the connection between the person and the art. Someone's asking, basically, how do you think you've been changed by becoming an artist or becoming a writer? Do you have a sense of who you were before you started writing and who you are now that's changed?
I mean, I've always been a writer. Like I mean, as soon as I could hold a pen, I was writing weird little horror stories as a child. Like I wrote a story about a lost turkey when I was maybe like 5 or 6 on my dad's stationery that he brought home from work. I like wrote a book about a lost turkey, and he's trying to get home, and he's like, he's at the zoo, he's at the hotel, he's trying to get, and then he finally gets home, and the last page is like a roasted turkey on a platter, and it says, "I wish I did not come here." And my parents were like, So like even from the beginning, I think I was thinking about, and then so, I was reading a lot of like dark, I was like Shel Silverstein and Roald Dahl and like all this kind of dark sort of children's literature, even from a very young age. But I think I've always, I kept an online journal for many years. Like I feel like I've always sort of conceived of and filtered my experience through writing. So like, even when I would sort of just have like an idea about like, or like an experience in my life. It was like, I felt like even as I was having it, I was like organizing it into like a writing context. Like I was like, how would I write about this or talk about this experience? And so for me, I almost like can't separate. It's like, I don't know what I would be if I didn't know how to write about both my own experiences and also just like things I think about in my mind. Like, I don't know what would happen if I couldn't describe them, because it just, to me, it's like actually really, it's like a really integral part of just like who I am as a person and like how I perceive the world. So it's almost like hard to say. I mean, I guess being a professional writer where I'm like, it's part of my living is like kind of a different matter, but in a way the answer is kind of the same. But like, I've always been a writer even before I, did anything else. Like I was always kind of thinking about the world in those terms, so.
And I would answer that question maybe just, I think so my mom emigrated to the US from Uganda, came to New York. She worked her whole professional life. She was largely a secretary, and that's how she took care of me and my sister and my grandmother. But on the weekends, she painted, she drew, she made dresses, she made little sculptures, and she would do that like just in the dining room while we were watching TV or whatever it might be. She played the piano a little bit. And I think the idea I had from a very early age was that my mother was an artist. And by that, it just meant she expressed herself through these beautiful things, and she didn't make them. She didn't try to sell them. There was no entrepreneurial aspect. She would just have these little sculptures up in the house or these drawings or whatever, or she might wear a dress out to a formal event. So in that way, I think when I started wanting to write stories, it felt like just the same thing as what my mom had done. And so it was, being an artist was not something that was particularly unique or special or like mythologized in any way. It was just like, here's the way that you express yourself. And the way I did it was different. It was just with writing. So I would say maybe I always felt like I was an artist, but maybe partly because the role was a pretty normalized role in the house. And then it just turned out that I got to become a professional at that thing, which feels great. It's nice and fun, but it feels like it's always been a part.
All right, I think we're already a little bit over time. I wonder if, as a final note, if the two of you could just tell us quickly, like, what are you working on now? What's coming next?
I'm working on a book that I've been working on since before COVID. I've been really, COVID really slowed me down just in my head. So I'm still working on that. It's like a linked short story collection. But I'm keeping busy. I'm just trying to get to the end as you do.
And actually, I'm at the thing I'm working on now. I'm at this place called Picture Shop. We I adapted one of my books for TV, a little 6-episode show. We wrapped shooting Friday. And so now we're in post-production. We'll be at this for about 4 months, I think. And then sometime next year, August, September next year, we'll have a show on TV, as long as there's still a world. We'll have a show on TV called The Devil in Silver.
Oh,
and,
I'm so
should
excited.
be fun. It should be fun.
It's so exciting.
Yeah. I like that. that caveat to everything we say. If there's still a world.
Right. I mean, right. It's like I'll finish the book, assuming
If there's, and I will be excited to read that book.
right.
Well, Victor and Carmen, thank you both so much for taking part today and for your contributions to the book. Again, for everyone, Unnatural Disasters, there are links in the chat here to find it, or you can just Google it and find it easily that way. Thanks again to everyone for showing up today and listening to us, and take care. Bye.
Thanks, Chris. Bye, Carmen.
Bye, Victor. Bye, Chris.